Welcome everyone to this week's Aquinas Econ lecture series. We're joined tonight by Dr. Bryan Leonard of Arizona State University. Bryan is an assistant professor in the School of Sustainability. He is a faculty member in the Center for Environmental Economics and Sustainability Policy. We were just chatting earlier that he's been a visiting fellow with the Hoover Institution, which is out at Stanford. He's written, I mean, God knows how many papers. I'm not even going to try to count them at this point, but he's published a lot. Just a really, really smart dude when it comes to how economics works with the environment, what we can learn to try to take care of the planet a little bit better. Because I think we can all probably agree that we could do a little bit better than we're currently doing. So with that, thank you, Dr. Leonard, for hanging out with us tonight, and I look forward to chatting with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Hi, everybody. Let me try to share my slides here, make sure that works. Are we seeing slides? Yeah, good. Awesome. Okay, yeah, so I have like a slight slide to introduce myself, although you just got a pretty good rundown of who I am. So my background, my training's in economics, PhD in economics from UC Santa Barbara, real focus on environmental economics and kind of the intersection of that and economic history and institutions. Honestly, a lot of what I do as a researcher and as an academic is based on my interests and my hobbies. So here's a picture of me fly fishing in Montana this summer, and doing things like that and hiking around leads me to interesting research questions that I use the tools of economics to answer. So things like, how should we ration access to popular recreational sites? So you may have seen in the news, a lot of places like Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon are getting really crowded, and it turns out economics can help us think about what to do about that. Things like, why is it that water's allocated on a first come, first served basis in the American West, but nowhere else in the world? And how does fragmented public land affect local economies? How does it affect wildfire? How does it affect habitat? It's just like kind of a sample of the type of thing that I like to work on based on kind of just my everyday interests and marrying that with my interest in economics. So tonight, I kind of want to talk about two questions and then dive into maybe some examples of what I'm going to try to convince you of when I answer these questions. So the two things I want to talk about are why should environmentalists study economics? So if you're primarily concerned with conservation or with sustainability, like a lot of my colleagues are, why do you need to know some economics to do a good job of that? But on the flip side, since I think a lot of you are here because of your interest in economics, I also wanted to say a couple of words about, why should economists care about the environment? What's interesting about environmental economics if you're primarily motivated by being interested in economics, which is kind of how I came to environmental economics. So to do that, a little bit of an outline, I kind of want to define sustainability, and we can think about kind of conservation more broadly, but anytime I give a talk and introduce myself and I say I'm at the School of Sustainability, people want to know what the heck, like, what do you mean by sustainability? It's a great question. We argue about it in every faculty meeting. So I'll say a couple words about that. Tell you kind of how I think about what economics is, because I think that's actually, depending on who you ask, you get kind of a different definition. And then that'll lead pretty quickly into, why should environmentalists study economics? Why should economists study the environment? And then I'll talk through, like, just to the extent that we have time, go through a couple examples, both from the literature and then maybe from my own research. So I sort of just stacked up a bunch of slides, and we'll see when I run out of time. So what is sustainability? My dean likes to brag that we're the nation's first school of sustainability. So what the heck does that mean? Well, he defines it this way. So this is a definition from Dr. Christopher Boone, who's my boss at ASU. He says, sustainability is about improving human well-being and ensuring social equity for present and future generations while safeguarding the planet's life-supporting ecosystems. Another definition that I like to cite a lot is from an environmental economist. I think Dr. Boone's background is actually in geography. So here's an economist definition of sustainability. Sustainability or a resource use rate that is sustainable is one that can be maintained over the long run without impairing the fundamental ability of the natural resource base to support future generations. So importantly, sustainability doesn't mean resources have to remain untouched, but it does mean that their rates of use must be chosen so as not to jeopardize future generations. So I want to draw a distinction between sort of preservation, thinking about nature as like this snow globe that we can't touch and should leave alone, and conservation or sustainability, which is not that we can't use natural resources, but it's that we need to use natural resources in a way that what we're doing can be sustained over time, hence the definition of the word sustainability. So that's kind of my perspective on how I approach sustainability, how I approach conservation. How do I approach economics? And then we'll talk about how the two are related. So I think, again, depending on who you ask, you can get a very different definition of what is economics. One of my favorite essays on this that I kind of love to hate is called "What Should Economists Do?" But a lot of people kind of would define economics in some combination of the following four ways. Some people define economics as the study of the efficient use of scarce resources. So right off the bat, we can kind of see how that's going to relate to sustainability, right? If we're focused on using scarce resources, that's going to be a useful set of tools to have to think about sustainability. Economics is also, I think, the study of how incentives affect individual behavior. So if you change the constraints that I face, if you offer me a reward to give a lecture, a fee versus not, that might change what I choose to do. If you charge me for my pollution, that might change how much I decide to pollute, those kind of things. But then economics can also tell us something about how individual decisions, so maybe my decision of how much to drive, whether to ride my bike or to sit in traffic, how those individual decisions can produce social outcomes. So when everybody wakes up in the morning and decides whether to get in their car or get on the bus, that's going to produce social outcomes, like how much traffic is there on the freeway today. And economics is useful for thinking about those things. And then more recently, this is kind of a controversial one, I think, but the reality is more recently, folks that did a PhD in economics kind of defined themselves by using a particular set of statistical methods to study causal inference from data. And so that's a big part of what I do as well. So I think my work has like pieces of all four of these things. So I just kind of wanted to put that on the table. Here's what economics is not, to me at least. Economics is not necessarily a pro-market or a capitalist ideology. So a lot of my colleagues come from a very non-economics background, and they think that economics has all of these like normative kind of pro-market things embedded in it. I think, if anything, economists spend maybe too much time worrying about things like market failure. And it's not just about making money, it's not about business, right? There's a difference between getting a degree in business and getting a degree in economics. So when I talk about economics, we really want to think about these things at the top. The other distinction that I want to draw, because I think it's useful for thinking about what economics can bring to sustainability, is thinking about positive versus normative economics. So if you're in Dr. Hebert's principles class, you probably have talked about this already. But just as a refresher, right, positive economics is if-then analysis. So it lets us build a predictive theory of how people are going to react to constraints. If you charge a fee to get on the freeway, then fewer people are probably going to drive. Not making any statement about whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing or whatever, but just making predictions about if we change some features of the world, if we change the constraints people face, then we predict they'll behave in a particular way. That's different from normative economics, which is more of a set of tools for answering those should questions, like should we charge people more to use the freeway? Should we charge people who don't recycle? That kind of thing. It turns out that even though a lot of economists don't want to go there, there are some formal tools within economics to help us think through those questions if we're willing to make certain assumptions. And those tools actually really come into play in environmental economics, because one of the areas where normative economics kind of rears its head is when we think about discounting, which is a way of comparing benefits and costs over time. So how do I compare the benefits of sort of preventing climate change 100 years from now with the costs of taking those actions today? Comparing those things that happen at different points in time requires something called discounting. And as soon as you pick a discount rate, which is like, what is the exchange rate between benefits today versus tomorrow, you're making some normative assumptions. So all these things are going to kind of come into play. Okay, so why should environmentalists study economics? So if we go back to that definition of sustainability, remember, it's about thinking about present versus future generations, right? We want to be able to have equity between present and future generations and sustain resource rate or a rate of resource use over time. So embedded in that notion of sustainability are a bunch of different trade-offs, which economists are really good at thinking about, right? So when we think about putting resources to their highest valued use, when we think about that efficient use of scarce resources, that comes down to evaluating trade-offs. And as folks thinking about sustainability or conservation, there's lots of trade-offs. There's trade-offs between present and future generations. So I already mentioned the example of climate change, but there's lots of other kind of sustainability problems where we can think about sort of, if we take action today, it's going to be costly, but that's going to create benefits in the future. So we need to be able to evaluate those trade-offs. Even if we're just thinking about within a particular generation, so we could just think about environmental policy today, there's going to be trade-offs between how different populations are affected. So you could think about, the developed world versus the developing world. You could think about, I mean, one thing that's interesting to me sitting here in Arizona, there's lots of interesting trade-offs between kind of what California does and how that affects us in Arizona as it comes to power generation and air quality and these kind of things. And there's always going to be competing policy goals, and there's always going to be competing uses for scarce resources. And economics is literally a toolkit for helping us make those comparisons in a rational and systematic way. So it's absolutely essential. But then the other reason that I think economics is essential for sustainability is that even though a lot of folks that study sustainability are really focused on the environment, and that's like kind of what they're motivated by, and that's what they care about, at the end of the day, sustainability is about human action, right? For a couple of reasons. One, it's humans that cause most sustainability challenges, right? We're talking about finding a rate of resource use by people. And if people are engaged in certain actions, that's what's going to cause sustainability challenges. So of course, then we're going to have to change human behavior, alter human action to solve those sustainability challenges. So a couple of writers kind of in ecology have started to describe it this way, as thinking about nature less of like a snow globe, like I was talking about before, and more like a rambunctious garden, like this dynamic thing that's evolving that people participate in. And if we think about it that way, then we really need to understand how changing the rules, how changing institutions is going to affect those human behaviors, and how those changes in human behavior will kind of add up and aggregate up into these social outcomes. So for those reasons, I always tell my students and my colleagues, I think economics is absolutely essential to understanding sustainability and understanding conservation. Since I think most of you are here because of your interest in economics, I also wanted to talk about why should economists study the environment? I almost skipped it. There we go. So I definitely came into environmental economics as primarily being interested in economics, and then kind of along the way, I found out like this was the field that I was really interested in. And as I said at the beginning, some of that has to do with kind of my hobbies and my interests, but some of it has to do with the fact that there's just a lot of really exciting applications of kind of core ideas from economics in environmental policy where there's scope for real and lasting impact. So here's just kind of a few examples, and we'll actually kind of unpack a few of these in a minute. But one thing that's gained a lot of traction in the last probably 20 to 30 years is kind of market-based environmental policy. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of kind of the idea of cap and trade. You know, if we want to limit pollution, we'll cap the total amount of pollution and let firms trade pollution permits or pollution credits to determine who's going to be the one reducing their pollution. ITQs are essentially the exact same thing for fisheries. We cap the total amount of fish that can be caught in a given fishery and give all the fishermen rights to catch a certain share of that cap, but then they can trade them, trying to harness market forces, trying to harness market equilibrium to make sure we achieve these environmental goals at the lowest costs. And now in California, they're trying to do something similar with groundwater rights and kind of markets for groundwater. And so what's interesting about this is that if you open up like your micro principles textbook or a price theory textbook, there's all these insights about the way that markets work, how market structure, things like monopoly affect efficiency. And all of those insights go into how these markets are designed. So this is a case where, instead of just kind of waking up and we're faced with kind of the markets that exist in the world, in some cases, economists are literally playing a role in how these markets are designed. Who gets the property rights? Who can trade with who? Are there restrictions on what the prices can do? And it's just really basic kind of price theory and market theory that guides how to do those things. So it can be really fun, really interesting. One of my favorite examples, there's this like 3-page paper by James Buchanan in the JPE in the 1970s that says, if you tax a monopolist, you might actually end up with too little of the activity or too little production of the thing you're worried about. So often we think about taxing polluters to reduce pollution. And Buchanan says, well, hey, if the polluter is a monopolist, they might be withholding production anyways. So you should think about that. Literally a 3-page paper with a graph. One of my favorite papers in environmental economics is like 100 pages long, taking that basic insight and applying it to the cement industry and saying, should we be worried about taxing carbon in this industry, or are we going to get too little production? So that's just kind of one really specific example of how these kind of key little insights can be applied and played out in thinking through market design. The other field that's kind of outside of my like core set of interests or expertise, but there's a lot of folks that do environmental economics that are really focused on consumer behavior and even behavioral economics. So you may have heard of the term green nudges, and the idea there is to really understand how really subtle shifts in policy, in literally like what appears on somebody's utility bill, can change their behavior. So things like changing the reference point, giving you a sad face if you're using more electricity than your neighbor, telling you you're using more electricity than your neighbor. So there's all sorts of folks running around working with utilities, literally running experiments with people's bills, changing the way information is presented to them and seeing if it affects their behavior. So that can be a really kind of fun, exciting application because you get to literally run experiments and see how people behave in the real world. There's another sort of big field kind of within the idea of consumer behavior, thinking about how people choose where to live and how we can understand those decisions, what economists in this field call sorting, to understand things about how people value environmental amenities. So you can answer questions like, what is the value of open space? What's the value of being near some sort of urban waterway? What's the value of having a mountain view? Because people reveal their preferences for those things when they choose where to live. And so we can examine prices for housing and how they differ based on the amount of environmental amenities they have, and learn some interesting things about kind of people's willingness to pay for the environment. Thinking more broadly than just in the housing market, there's an entire field of environmental economics, just referred to as valuation, which is trying to estimate the value of things in nature, or trying to estimate the value of non-market goods is usually the way that it's put. So if I were to ask you how much is an iPod worth, how much is a pair of shoes worth, how much is an NFT, which I still don't really understand, how much is that worth? There's a price, right? That price is a pretty good signal of what people are willing to pay for it, what the value of it is, because it's exchanged in a market. But for so many things that we care about in the context of sustainability and conservation, the thing is not traded in the market. So open space, habitat, the Grand Canyon, all these things are not traded in the market. So there's not a price I can look at and say, oh, that's what it's worth to have, pristine habitat in Yellowstone National Park, or that's what it's worth to have some in-stream flow in the Yellowstone River or in the Colorado River. And so there's a whole field of folks that try to run around and both look at people's behavior and conduct really clever surveys to try to understand what people's willingness to pay for these non-market goods is. So one example of that in the context of recreation is called the travel cost method. And you literally just look at how much you go to a site and you run a survey. So you go stand at the gate of the Grand Canyon and you ask people where they came from and how long they're staying for. And from that, you figure out, oh, you came from Alabama, you came from New York, you estimate, here's what it probably cost you to get here to take this trip. Your willingness to pay to see the Grand Canyon must be at least what it costs you to get here. And so that's kind of a clever way, you can sort of formalize that and do that systematically. And we can use that to get estimates for what people would be willing to pay to visit certain sites. Similarly, you can design surveys that ask people about kind of different levels of conservation and what fees they'd be willing to pay to get a sense of what people are willing to pay to preserve open space and habitat and endangered species and all these kinds of things. And then finally, kind of a little more near and dear to my heart, there's lots of interesting applications in institutions and property rights. And some of this has to do with the market design stuff I mentioned at the top, but a lot of it's is broader than that. So There's all sorts of interesting common pool resource dilemmas that come up in the context of environmental economics, both in the US and globally. So there's lots of interesting applications for thinking about how institutions affect people's ability to share natural resources, whether that's a river or a lake or an aquifer or an oil reservoir or a fishery or whatever it is. There's lots of interesting insights about how property rights to land affect use of these other attached natural resources like groundwater underneath your farm, for instance, and how those things affect economic development in the long run. And then there's lots of interesting applications for thinking about the relationship between private and public land, which is a big deal out here in the American West, because about half of the land out here is owned by the government. So those are just kind of some really specific, interesting things where you can take really basic ideas from economics and have a big impact in the environment. So to kind of bring these two ideas back together, why should environmentalists care about economics? Why should economists care about the environment? Another thing I want to emphasize is that the stakes are really high when we think about a lot of these sustainability challenges. So my personal bread and butter is not really focused on climate change when it comes to my research, but that's what a lot of people focus on. So if we just think about that as an example, or even kind of anything that has long run implications, there's really large benefits, right? We're talking about the welfare of present generations. We're talking about the welfare of future generations. Getting these things right is going to affect people's health. It's going to affect their ability to recreate. It's going to affect our investments in science and medicine in the long run. But these policy proposals are really costly, which is why they're so controversial. So, there's one study that estimated that sort of dealing with reducing carbon, like just carbon, no other sort of sustainability challenges, would cost literally $130 billion to do that in the US in 2005 to sort of get the carbon reductions we would have wanted from a climate change perspective. So very high stakes, lots of money on the table. So it's really important to get it right? This isn't the kind of thing where we want to kind of just shoot from the hip and like make up some policy and kind of see what happens. We really want to use our full toolkit that's at our disposal to try to get it right. And I think I want to start with at least one example of how not getting it right can be pretty problematic. So a couple examples, I don't know that I'll have time to go into all three of them, but the first one kind of doesn't have much to do with my research, but the second two are kind of directly drawn from my research to give a couple examples. So I think we'll get to at least one of those. So one thing I do want to talk about is unintended consequences of policy and what happens when kind of engineers, I always pick on engineers when I'm talking to my students. What happens when engineers design environmental policy and don't include economists? And we get something called the rebound effect, and it's pretty interesting. Then I'll talk about a couple of applications of thinking through kind of property rights and natural resources in my own work. So a very popular way, especially think 30, 40, 50 years ago, a very popular way for addressing pollution and other environmental challenges is through technology standards. And so the idea behind a technology standard is that some engineer figures out a technology that is more fuel efficient or more water efficient, uses less of an input and gets you the same output, and says, hey, we have all these polluting factories, we have all these farmers using a ton of water because they're using really inefficient technology. Wouldn't it be great if we just forced all of them to use a more efficient technology, or heck, we could even pay them to use the more efficient technology? Then we could get the same amount of production, right? But have less pollution or be using up less water. So a lot of environmental regulation kind of has this characteristic of specifying what technologies firms have to use, or more recently, like paying firms to upgrade their technology. Unfortunately, economics comes into play in a way that the engineers did not anticipate. So this can lead to what's called a rebound effect, which actually William Stanley Jevons noticed a couple hundred years ago. And basically the problem is if you increase input efficiency, so if you make it so that I can get the same amount of output for less input, or equivalently, I can get more output for the same amount of input, you change the relative costs of the different inputs facing the supplier. And so by changing that relative cost, what's that going to do? That's going to change their incentive to use that input versus some other input. And it turns out this rears its head kind of all over the place in environmental economics, because the two things, often economists are really worried about energy efficiency or water efficiency, right? And so what happens when we try to promote these more efficient technologies? So here's an example of the rebound effect in the context of cars. This is a study by Green and co-authors in 1999. And basically what they're looking at is they're looking at what happens to vehicle miles traveled as people get more fuel efficient cars. And what they find is that people basically treat fuel efficiency and fuel cost kind of in the same way. So if I'm a consumer and I'm deciding how much to drive, and you change the price of gasoline on me, my behavioral response to that is going to be the same as if you gave me a new car with a different engine that was more fuel efficient. I'm basically, so in other words, if you give me a more fuel efficient car, I'm going to act like gas just got cheaper, basically. And so what that means is that about 20% of the potential savings, like the engineer's estimate of how much, gasoline we would save by having people adopt more fuel efficient cars, about 20% of that savings is lost due to the fact that people actually drive more when they have a more fuel efficient car. So what happens with the rebound effect, right, is that an engineer will estimate, here's how much of the input we could save by changing to this more efficient technology. And when they do that estimate, they hold behavior constant. They say, if people drove just the same amount and we gave them more fuel efficient cars, here's how much fuel we could save. The rebound effect comes in because people don't drive the same amount. They're going to drive more because it's cheaper to drive. And in this case, it eats away about 20% of the savings. The other place where this is rampant is in energy efficiency, kind of in residential and commercial settings, as I was talking about. So this is actually ripped from the textbook I use in my class, looking at studies across a bunch of different kind of energy efficiency enhancements to things like heating, cooling, lighting, automotive transport, which we just talked about, and different process improvements, and kind of what the literature has found about the scale of the rebound effect. So in some settings, it's actually quite small. And in some settings, it's maybe as large as 100%, which is to say, you force people to adopt a more efficient technology, and they increase their use of that technology so much that you didn't get any input savings. And so a really fun kind of extreme example of that is pretty close to my research, because I do a lot of work on water, is they actually had a greater than 100% rebound effect when they had farmers adopt kind of new irrigation technologies in the Ogallala Aquifer. So Ogallala Aquifer overlies parts of Texas, Oklahoma, all the way up through the Great Plains. It's being depleted at kind of a rapid and alarming rate. So one thing that some of those states did is they literally paid farmers to adopt more efficient irrigation technologies. And they went from this picture on the left, which is just sort of a center pivot irrigation system. You can see the sprinklers are up high. And so the water's kind of getting spewed out into the atmosphere, and what actually makes it onto the plants is not great. They paid farmers to switch to the picture on the right, which is called drop nozzle irrigation. So you're irrigating right above the surface of the plant. It's supposed to be much more water efficient. So that's great. If farmers had planted the exact same crops and the exact same amount of those crops, would have saved a ton of water. But in fact, what farmers did is that they were able to water more. So they actually changed which crops they were planting. They planted more water intensive crops because now, their water use efficiency is higher. It's essentially cheaper to apply water to your crops now. So they planted more water intensive crops, and they actually brought land back into production that had been fallow. And so the result of this program that spent, millions of dollars of taxpayer money to provide water efficiency enhancements for farmers is that they actually started depleting the aquifer more rapidly. So that's just a kind of a fun example of why it's really important to have economists at the table when we're thinking about environmental policy, and not just those pesky engineers that are going to be focused on really cool technologies, but not taking behavior into account and how that can cause problems. So I want to talk about maybe one example from my own research just for a moment here, and then I'll kind of stop and leave some time for questions. So one thing, this is kind of new work. I'm still kind of charting my course through this, but what you're looking at here on the left is a map of Yellowstone National Park in the middle and kind of the brown, and then a bunch of national forests around it in green. And then all of those squiggly lines are the migratory routes of the dozen or so elk herds that hang out in Yellowstone in the summer. So if any of you have gone to Yellowstone, when you go to see grizzly bears, when you go to see wolves, part of the reason they're there is that there's a lot of elk that hang out in the park in the summer. And what some ecologists have recently discovered in the last decade or so is that these animals spend as much as 80% of their time actually hanging out on people's farms and ranches. So they hang out in the park in the summer when it's nice and warm, but it gets very cold in Yellowstone in the winter. And so they migrate down into kind of lower elevation areas. And that's kind of what you're seeing in this map. And so they spend a bunch of their time on private land. So these are public natural resources that drive, or at least partially drive, visitation to the park that provides benefits for this whole economy. And then they go hang out and eat particular farmers' alfalfa. They break their fences, they give disease to their cattle. So it creates this really interesting kind of institutional property rights problem. So in some new work with this guy here, Arthur Middleton, who's one of the ecologists who's kind of, I always like to show this picture because like all of my work is sitting in front of a computer staring at a screen, and he's like out in the field putting collars on elk and stuff. So they put these GPS collars on the elk and they track them around, and it's great. So basically what we're doing is we're taking his data on like where these elk are and when, and a bunch of data that I've collected on what landowners are doing, what crops they're planting, whether they're planting crops, how much they're developing, to try to understand this kind of dynamic interplay between land use decisions and these large scale migrations, to understand how farmers, ranchers' behavior is affecting these migrations and vice versa. And then my colleague here at ASU, Kaylin Kretz, is really good at basically these mathematical models that tell you if you wanted to try to create kind of conservation reserves to preserve these corridors, what would you need? How would you approach landowners? Which parcels would you want to try to include in your corridor? And then what kind of contracts, what kind of market designs could we think of that would help compensate landowners for sort of incurring these costs and also provide kind of all of the public benefits? I'm talking about it at kind of a 30,000 foot level because we're still trying to figure it out. But basically the idea is that instead of having this like what we call fortress conservation, where you have millions of acres of public land, what if we just had kind of flexible one-time lease payments for private landowners when their habitat's needed in a particular season? So we're calling that pop-up conservation. It's kind of like Airbnb for elk. And so we're trying to think through like, what are the data that you would need to design a system like that? And then theoretically thinking about that market design again, from an economic standpoint, what characteristics, what features should that market have to function well? So that brings me pretty much to time. So I'm gonna skip over that little guy right there and just open it up for questions. We can talk about other examples. We can talk about the examples I've raised. I'm happy to chat about anything.